The heat of the Gallipoli Peninsula in August 1915 was not merely a temperature, but a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of dust, flies, and the sickly sweet scent of decay that hung over Suvla Bay. It is here, amidst the tactical failures and the bloody stalemate of the First World War, that we find the setting for one of the most enduring and unsettling mysteries of 20th century warfare. To understand the incident of the Vanishing Battalion, one must first understand the ground on which they stood. This was not a neat, organized battlefield. It was a chaotic scrubland of dry gullies and salt lakes, baked hard by the Turkish sun, where navigation was a nightmare and communication lines were fragile at best. On the afternoon of August 12th, the order came down for an advance. The objective was clear in theory, but muddled in practice. The British forces were to clear the Turkish positions from the lower slopes of the Tek Tepe Ridge to support a wider offensive. Among the units marshaled for this push was the 1/5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment. These were not seasoned regulars, hardened by years of colonial skirmishes. They were territorials, men drawn from the king's own estate at Sandringham. These were gamekeepers, gardeners, and grooms, servants of the royal household led by their manager, Captain Frank Beck, and the battalion commander, Colonel Sir Horace Beauchamp. They were a tight-knit community, transplanted from the lush greens of Norfolk to the arid, hostile waste of the Dardanelles. The attack began late in the day, as the artillery barrage lifted, or rather, failed to make a significant dent in the Ottoman defenses. The Norfolks stepped out of the safety of their trenches. The advance was disjointed from the start. The terrain broke up the lines, turning a coordinated wave of infantry into scattered pockets of men fighting through dense scrub and taking heavy fire from snipers concealed in the landscape. The dust kicked up by thousands of boots created a fog of war that was literal as well as metaphorical. It is at this point that the historical record splinters. There is the official military account, dry and devastating, which speaks of a unit advancing too far, losing contact with its flanks, and being cut off. Then there is the other account, the one that has fueled speculation for over a century, born from the testimony of 3 soldiers from the New Zealand Field Engineers. These men, named Reichardt, Newberry, and Newman, were positioned on an elevated piece of ground overlooking the plain where the Norfolks were advancing. Their vantage point gave them a clear view of the dry lake bed known as the Kuchuk Anafarta Ova. According to the statement these 3 men signed years later, the weather on that afternoon was peculiar. Despite the cloudless blue of the Mediterranean sky, they reported seeing a series of strange, loaf-shaped clouds hovering low over the battlefield. They described these clouds as being completely stationary, unaffected by the stiff breeze that was blowing from the south. This detail alone strikes a discordant note in the chaotic symphony of the battle. In a landscape defined by movement, by the shifting dust, the flying shrapnel, the running men, these clouds were allegedly unnatural anchors, fixed points in the sky. The witnesses claimed that one of these clouds was larger than the rest, settling directly on the ground across the dry creek bed that the Norfolks had to cross. They described it as dense and solid-looking, roughly 800 feet in length and 200 feet high. It was not the wispy mist of sea fog, nor was it the black smoke of burning brush. They recalled it as having a distinct structure, almost tangible, reflecting the sunlight in a way that seemed alien to the surrounding environment. As the scattered line of the 5th Norfolks pushed forward, led by Colonel Beauchamp and Captain Beck, they approached this anomaly. The fighting was fierce. The heat was relentless. The adrenaline of the charge would have narrowed the soldiers' vision to the few yards in front of them, focusing entirely on survival and the next piece of cover. From the perspective of the New Zealand sappers watching from the high ground, the Norfolks did not skirt the cloud. They did not hesitate. They marched straight into it. The narrative provided by the sappers describes the scene with a chilling simplicity. They watched as hundreds of men, the flower of the Sandringham estate, walked into the gray mass and simply ceased to be visible. There was no hesitation in the ranks, no sign of confusion as the first men breached the wall of mist. They continued to file in, row after row, company after company. The witnesses claimed that the cloud was so opaque that the soldiers disappeared the moment they crossed the threshold. It swallowed them whole. The New Zealanders waited for the battalion to emerge on the other side. They watched the far edge of the cloud, expecting to see the khaki figures break through and continue their charge up the slopes toward the Turkish lines. But no one came out. The firing continued elsewhere on the line. The war ground on. But in that specific sector, within that specific atmospheric anomaly, there was a void. Then came the end of the incident, as described in the testimony. Roughly an hour after the last of the soldiers had marched into the mist, the cloud began to move. But it did not disperse like smoke or drift with the wind. The witnesses stated that it rose vertically, lifting off the ground in a solid mass. It ascended slowly, joining the other loaf-shaped clouds that had been waiting in the sky. Once they had merged, the formation moved away towards the north, sailing against the wind, drifting towards Bulgaria and Thrace. When the cloud lifted, the ground beneath it was empty. The creek bed was bare. There were no bodies, no equipment, no wounded men crying out for water. The 250 men or so who had comprised the leading edge of the advance, the Sandringham Company, were gone. It was as if they had been wiped from the surface of the earth. This account transforms a military tragedy into a locked-room mystery on the scale of a battlefield. It suggests an event that defies the laws of physics and meteorology. However, as an investigator, one must look at the silence that followed. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the confusion was absolute. Roll calls were made, and names were shouted into the dusk, but only silence answered. The 5th Norfolks had suffered horrific casualties across the board, but this specific group, the men from the royal estate, had vanished without a trace. Sir Ian Hamilton, the commander of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, later wrote in his dispatches that the battalion had charged into the forest and was lost to sight, none ever seeing them again. This official line, while poetic, creates a space for the mystery to fester. It acknowledges the disappearance, but offers no explanation. The families back in Norfolk waited. The king waited. Queen Alexandra, who had a personal connection to many of the missing men, made inquiries. But for years, there was nothing. No prisoners of war were reported by the Red Crescent. No identity discs were recovered. The incident is compounded by the delay in the witness testimony. The detailed account from the New Zealand sappers did not surface publicly until the 50th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings in 1965. This gap of half a century casts a long shadow over the reliability of the memory. Was it a collective hallucination brought on by heat exhaustion and the trauma of war? Was it a trick of the light, a mirage common in such intense heat, where the shimmering air can distort and hide objects? Or was it a later fabrication, a tall tale that grew in the telling until it became a myth? Yet there are details in their account that linger comfortably in the realm of the plausible, only to be twisted by the context. The description of a ground mist is not impossible in a coastal region, though the specific density and shape are peculiar. The idea of a unit being swallowed by the terrain is a staple of military history. Regiments march into fog and are ambushed, destroyed, and buried in shallow graves. But the assertion that the cloud moved against the wind and left no trace of the dead behind is the detail that refuses to align with conventional history. We must also consider the psychological state of the observers, watching from a distance, helpless to intervene, seeing allies vanish into a sector from which no sound or signal returned. The mind might grasp for an explanation that fits the visual data, however impossible. The brain seeks patterns. It constructs a narrative to explain the sudden transition from presence to absence. A cloud that takes men away is a cleaner, albeit stranger, explanation than a massacre in a scrub-filled gully where the vegetation hides the fallen. The incident of the Vanishing Battalion sits at the intersection of fog of war confusion and paranormal folklore. It is a story of men marching into the unknown and the silence that followed. As night fell on August 12th, 1915, the battlefield at Suvla Bay cooled, but the mystery had already solidified. The roll call remained unanswered. The families in the cottages of Sandringham were left with a void where their sons and husbands used to be. Whether taken by the Turks or taken by the sky, the result was the same. They were gone, and in the absence of bodies, in the absence of a definitive end, the story of the cloud began to take root, growing in the dark corners of history, waiting to be told and retold, challenging us to separate the tragedy of war from the anomalies that sometimes accompany it. The incident was over, but the investigation was only just beginning, and the eventual discovery of the dead would prove to be just as complex and unsettling as the myth of their disappearance. To understand the true strangeness of what happened on August 12th, 1915, one must first understand the landscape. This was not the trench warfare of the Western Front, where lines were drawn in mud and defined by inches. Suvla Bay in Gallipoli was a chaotic, scorched theater of scrub, dust, and blinding heat. The terrain was a nightmare of dried creek beds and confusion, where maps were often useless, and visibility was dictated by the shimmering haze of the Mediterranean summer. It was here, amidst the smoke and the stench of wild thyme crushed under heavy boots, that the Norfolk Regiment prepared to advance. The unit in question was the 1st 5th Battalion, specifically the segment known as the Sandringham Company. These were not anonymous conscripts drawn from the sprawling industrial cities of England. They were the King's men, quite literally. They were staff from the royal estate at Sandringham, gardeners, gamekeepers, grooms, and farm laborers, led by their estate manager, Captain Frank Beck. They had enlisted together, trained together, and now they stood ready to fight together. Leading the charge was the commanding officer, Colonel Sir Horace Beauchamp, a man known for his aggression and courage, perhaps to a fault. The objective was clear, or as clear as anything was in the Gallipoli Campaign. They were to take the heights, specifically a position known as Hill 60. The attack began in the late afternoon, with the sun dipping lower, but the heat still oppressive. As the artillery barrage lifted, the Norfolks rose from their positions and moved forward. This is where history begins to fracture, splitting into the official military record and the enduring, unsettling legend of the Vanishing Battalion. The anomalies began almost immediately. According to standard military reports, the advance was a disaster of command and control. The terrain broke up the formations, mixing the Norfolks with other units. The Turkish machine gun fire was relentless, pinning down the support lines. But Colonel Beauchamp and the Sandringham men pressed on, seemingly immune to the chaos around them. pushing further and further into the enemy territory, creating a salient from which they would never return. However, it is the testimony of the eyewitnesses that introduces the element of the uncanny, the detail that transforms a tragic military blunder into a century-old mystery. The primary account does not come from the British officers trying to cover up a failure, nor does it come from the Turkish defenders. It comes from 3 soldiers of the New Zealand Field Engineers, Frederick Reichardt, Thomas Newberry, and J.L. Newman. These 3 men were positioned on a high vantage point overlooking the battlefield. What they claimed to see was not the fog of war, but a literal fog, a meteorological impossibility that defied the physics of the day. In a sworn affidavit produced decades later, but consistent with the stories they had told since the war, the sappers described the sky as clear and blue, a typical Aegean summer day, except for the clouds. They reported seeing 6 or 8 loaf-shaped clouds hovering over Hill 60. They described them as peculiar, almost solid-looking structure with a distinct gray-brown hue. These clouds did not drift with the breeze. They remained stationary, anchored in the sky despite a prevailing wind blowing from the south. Beneath this formation lay the largest cloud of all, sitting heavily on the ground, spanning a length of roughly 800 feet and a height of 200 feet. The New Zealanders were adamant about its density. They claimed it looked solid, like a physical barrier rather than a collection of water vapor. This is the moment the narrative shifts from a battle report to something approaching the paranormal. The sappers watched as the Norfolk Regiment, led by Colonel Beauchamp, continued their charge. The British soldiers didn't stop at the edge of the mist. They marched straight into it. The eyewitnesses described the men entering the gray mass and simply fading from view, swallowed up by the opacity. What happened next is the core of the anomaly. According to the affidavit, once the last of the Sandringham men had disappeared into the fog, the cloud began to move. It lifted off the ground, rising slowly to join the other loaf-shaped clouds waiting above. Once they had merged, the entire formation moved away, drifting north towards Bulgaria against the direction of the wind. When the cloud lifted, the ground beneath it was empty. There were no bodies. There were no discarded rifles. There was no sign of a struggle. 250 men, along with 16 officers, including Colonel Beauchamp, were simply gone. The New Zealand engineers waited for the mist to clear completely, expecting to see the aftermath of a skirmish or the digging of defensive trenches. Instead, they saw only the dry, scrubby earth of Hill 60. The vanishing was total. This account creates a profound dissonance when held against the harsh reality of military logistics. How does a company of over 250 men disappear in an afternoon? In the days following the attack, the British commanders listed the men as missing. The assumption was that they had been captured, perhaps marched off to Constantinople as prisoners of war. The families back on the Sandringham estate waited for news. King George V and Queen Alexandra made inquiries, but no news came. The Red Cross searched the lists of prisoners held by the Ottoman Empire, but the names of the Sandringham men never appeared. It was not until the war ended that the first cracks in the mystery began to appear. And yet, these discoveries only deepened the sense of unease. In 1919, the Reverend Charles Pierrepoint Edwards was tasked with the grim duty of locating and identifying the war dead in that sector. He ventured into the area behind the Turkish lines where the Norfolks had last been seen. Edwards found bodies. He found a mass of remains in a ravine, roughly a mile beyond the Allied front line. He identified the body of Colonel Beauchamp by his gold watch. He identified Captain Beck. He found the cap badges of the Norfolk Regiment. This discovery should have closed the book on the mystery. It suggested that the unit had simply advanced too far, been cut off, and was annihilated in a desperate last stand. But the condition of the remains and the location raised new, disturbing questions that fueled the anomaly rather than extinguishing it. One of the most persistent rumors, one that still circulates in the quiet corners of military archives, is the manner of their death. Some reports from the burial details suggested that many of the men had been shot in the head, implying execution rather than combat death. This led to a dark theory that the Norfolks had surrendered and were subsequently massacred by their captors. However, the Turkish commanders vehemently denied this, and their records showed no knowledge of the unit's fate. They claimed the British soldiers never reached their lines. To the Turkish defenders, the Norfolks had simply melted away before making contact. Furthermore, the location of the bodies complicated the timeline. If the New Zealanders saw them walk into a cloud on the slopes of Hill 60, how did they end up a mile further inland, deep in a ravine? The discrepancy between the eyewitness account of a supernatural abduction and the forensic evidence of a massacre created a friction that has never been resolved. We must also consider the psychological state of the witnesses. Reichardt and his companions waited 50 years to put their story into a formal affidavit. Why the delay? Was it a fear of ridicule? Or was it that, over half a century, the trauma of watching men march to their deaths had warped their memory, transforming a confusing cloud of dust and smoke into a solid, mystical vehicle of deliverance? The human mind struggles to process the industrial slaughter of the First World War. It is often easier to believe that the brave men of the king's estate were spirited away by a mysterious cloud than to accept they were cut down by machine gun fire and left to rot in a foreign ravine. And yet, the specificity of the New Zealanders' description remains haunting. They did not describe a chaotic fog of war. They described a meteorological structure with defined edges, specific colors, and movement that defied the wind. There is another layer to this anomaly, one found in the regimental history itself. The loss of the Sandringham Company was a devastation to the local community in Norfolk. It wasn't just a military loss, it was a social catastrophe. Every family on the estate lost a father, a brother, or a son. The lack of closure, the absence of bodies for 4 years, and the strange rumors filtering back from the front created a vacuum that needed to be filled. The story of the cloud became a way to sanitize the horror. It turned a tragedy into a legend. But even stripping away the legend, the facts remain stubborn. A highly trained unit, led by an experienced colonel, advanced into a confined area. 3 independent witnesses on a flanking hill watched them enter a dense mist. When the mist cleared, the unit was gone. The eventual discovery of bodies years later does not explain the visual anomaly reported by the sappers. It does not explain why the cloud moved against the wind. It does not explain why the Turkish forces had no record of engagement with this specific group at that specific location. The official British history of the war, written years later, contains a succinct and chilling phrase regarding the fate of the battalion. They were engulfed by the unknown. It is a rare admission of uncertainty in a genre of writing usually obsessed with tactical facts. We are left with a puzzle that has 2 distinct shapes. One is the shape of a massacre, a brutal reality of war where a unit overextends and is destroyed. The other is the shape of a cloud, a loaf of bread in the sky, a silent abductor that spared the men the indignity of death by removing them from the earth entirely. The anomaly of the Vanishing Battalion sits at the intersection of these 2 shapes. It forces us to ask what we are willing to believe. Do we trust the forensic evidence of the Reverend Edwards, who found bones and watches in a ravine? Or do we trust the eyes of the sappers who swore, until their dying days, that they watched the earth reject the soldiers, hiding them in a gray-brown shroud that sailed away towards Bulgaria? As we delve deeper into the investigation, we must look at the source of the cloud story more critically. The affidavit signed by Reichert in 1965 was released at a time when interest in the metaphysical was growing. Was he influencing the narrative, or finally feeling safe enough to share a truth he had harbored since 1915? The timing is suspicious, yet the consistency of his story with the other 2 men is difficult to dismiss as mere fabrication. They had nothing to gain by inventing such a tale. The atmosphere of Suvla Bay remains charged with this ambiguity. Visitors to the site today describe a strange silence on Hill 60. The scrub has grown back, covering the dry creek beds and the ravine where the bodies were eventually found. But the air still feels heavy, and the heat still plays tricks on the eyes. It is a place where the barrier between the seen and the unseen feels thin. In the end, the anomaly is not just about the weather or the movement of troops. It is about the gap in the record, the minutes and hours where the Norfolk Regiment ceased to exist in the eyes of the British Army, the Turkish Army, and history itself. For that brief window of time inside the cloud, they were nowhere. They were anomalies in the data stream of the war. Whether they walked out of the cloud and into a massacre, or whether the cloud was merely a hallucination masking their slaughter, the event remains a scar on the historical narrative, a moment where the rational explanation feels insufficient to cover the magnitude of the disappearance. The mist of Gallipoli does not give up its secrets easily, and the fate of the king's men remains suspended there, somewhere between the dry earth and the impossible sky. The heat of the Gallipoli Peninsula in August 1915 was not merely a weather condition, but a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of dust, flies, and the sickly sweet scent of decay that pressed down on the men of the Allied Expeditionary Force. To investigate the vanishing of the Norfolk Regiment, specifically the 1st 5th Battalion, one must first understand that the landscape itself seemed conspiring to hide the truth. In the archives of military history, there are tragic defeats, and then there are voids. The story of the Norfolks is a void that has been filled with smoke, mirrors, and spectral clouds for over a century. But when you strip away the legend, you are left with a series of dead ends that are perhaps more chilling than the supernatural explanations that replaced them. The narrative of the vanishing begins with a tactical maneuver that went horribly wrong, but the mystery lies in the silence that followed. On August 12th, 1915, during the attack on Tek Teep, Colonel Sir Horace Beauchamp led 266 men and 16 officers into an advance against Turkish positions. They were the local boys from the king's Sandringham estate, grooms, gardeners, and farmhands who had traded their rural quiet for the hell of the Dardanelles. They crested a ridge, marched into the haze of battle, and simply ceased to exist. For the investigative mind, the first dead end is the official record itself. In the immediate aftermath, there was chaos. Sir Ian Hamilton, the commander of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, sent a dispatch back to London that would become the seed of the mystery. He wrote that the battalion charged into the forest and was lost to sight or sound, adding that not one of them ever came back. This statement, written in the fog of war, created a locked room mystery on the scale of a battlefield. Families in Norfolk waited for letters that never came. The British government, overwhelmed by the staggering losses of the campaign, had no answers to give. The file was effectively marked missing in action, a bureaucratic purgatory that offered no closure. The investigation hits its second and most bizarre dead end 50 years later. If the official silence was the first wall, the sudden eruption of a supernatural witness account in 1965 was a labyrinth. 3 New Zealand veterans, Frederick Reichardt, Jonah Newberry, and Thomas Newman, came forward with a testimony that transformed a military tragedy into a ghost story. They claimed to have watched the assault from a vantage point overlooking Suvla Bay. In their account, the Norfolks did not just march into battle smoke. They marched into a strange, loaf-shaped cloud that settled directly over the dry creek bed where the soldiers were advancing. The description provided by the New Zealand sappers is incredibly specific and unnervingly visual. They described a cloud that was extremely dense, almost solid-looking, and completely distinct from the surrounding air. It was roughly 800 feet long and 200 feet high. They watched, spellbound, as the British soldiers marched up the sunken road and straight into this gray mass. The critical detail, the one that sends a shiver down the spine of anyone reading the transcript, is that no one came out the other side. When the last man disappeared into the mist, the cloud reportedly lifted off the ground and floated away against the wind, taking the battalion with it. As a journalist analyzing this, one must pause. This testimony is the ultimate dead end because it defies verification. It relies on the memories of men half a century after the event, recalling a moment of high trauma and confusion. Yet it persisted. It became the dominant narrative. Why? Because a cloud abduction, as terrifying as it is, suggests a clean break. It suggests the men were taken, removed from the earth, rather than destroyed by it. It offers a mystical alternative to the meat grinder of machine gun fire. However, when we overlay the maps of 1915 with the testimony of 1965, the cracks appear. The New Zealanders claimed this happened on August 21st or 28th, but the Norfolks vanished on August 12th. The locations they described do not perfectly align with where the 1st Fifth was operating. The memory, distorted by time, and perhaps the psychological need to make sense of the senseless, created a false path. We must then turn away from the sky and look at the ground, where the grimmest dead end awaited the recovery teams. The war ended in 1918, and in 1919, the Imperial War Graves Commission arrived to clean up the mess. Reverend Charles Pierrepoint Edwards was tasked with finding the missing men of the Norfolk Battalion. This is where the investigation shifts from folklore to forensics. Edwards did not find a cloud. He found a mass grave. The discovery was made about 800 yards behind the Turkish front lines in a small ravine. The report from the grave's registration unit is stark and devoid of poetry. They found 122 bodies. The identification was difficult, but the cap badges told the story. They were Norfolk's. They found the body of Colonel Beauchamp himself. The initial relief of finding the remains, however, leads to another, darker mystery. A forensic dead end that fuels the conspiracy theorists to this day. The location of the bodies suggested that the men had pushed much further behind enemy lines than anyone thought possible. They had broken through only to be cut off. But it was the condition of the remains that created a hushed uneasiness among the recovery team. Many of the bodies were found in an area of roughly 1 square mile, not scattered as they would be in a running battle, but clustered. A local Turkish farmer told the recovery team that the bodies had been found thrown into a ravine. This detail suggests a massacre. It suggests that the men surrendered or were captured and then executed. This is the dead end that the British military establishment was arguably desperate to avoid. In 1919, the wounds of the war were fresh. The narrative of a heroic charge into the unknown was preferable to the reality of a mass execution or a tactical blunder that left a battalion isolated and slaughtered. The report mentions that 180 bodies were found in total, with 122 being Norfolk's. But where were the others? The battalion was over 250 men strong. Over half, the unit was still unaccounted for. The grave answered the question of death, but it did not answer the question of the missing. We are left with a fragmented picture. The cloud story serves as a psychological dead end, a barrier constructed by human minds to block out the horror of industrial warfare. The official report serves as a bureaucratic dead end, a sanitized summary that glosses over the terror of those final moments. And the grave itself is a physical dead end, providing bodies, but no story, evidence of death, but not the method. What makes this investigation so unsettling is the gap between the 122 bodies found and the 266 who vanished. The discrepancy allows the mystery to breathe. Did the others die in the surrounding scrub, their bones dragged away by scavengers? Were they taken prisoner and marched to camps from which they never returned, their paperwork lost in the collapse of the Ottoman Empire? Or is there a grain of truth in the New Zealanders' hallucination? Perhaps the cloud was a dense fog of poison gas, or the smoke of a massive brush fire ignited by shelling, disorienting the men until they walked off cliffs or into waiting Turkish bayonets. The investigative journey into the Vanishing Battalion reveals that the true dead end is the limit of historical recovery. We can look at the maps. We can read the diaries of Sir Ian Hamilton, and we can analyze the decomposition rates of bodies in the Turkish sun. But we cannot reconstruct the final 10 minutes of the Sandringham Company. We cannot know what Colonel Beauchamp saw as he crested that ridge. The legend of the cloud persists not because it is the most likely explanation, but because the alternatives are simply a catalogue of sorrow. In the end, the story of the Norfolk Regiment is a study in how we process the unknown. The investigative path does not lead to a singular villain or a revealed secret mechanism. It leads to a ravine in Turkey where the silence is absolute. The dead ends are not failures of the investigation. They are the architecture of the tragedy. They force us to confront the fact that in war, men do not vanish into clouds. They vanish into the earth, into administrative errors, and into the devastating forgetfulness of history. The cloud is a metaphor that became a memory, a ghost story draped over a grave to hide the brutal, unromantic reality of a dead end from which there was no return. The mystery remains not in what happened, but in how we chose to remember it. We chose the impossible cloud over the unbearable earth. The heat of the Suvla Bay Plain in August 1915 was not merely a meteorological condition. It was a physical oppression. It distorted the air, bending light and turning the scrub-covered landscape into a shimmering, unreliable canvas. When we look back at the disappearance of the 5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment, specifically the Sandringham Company, we must first understand this environment. It was a place where the line between the solid and the ethereal was already blurring under the glare of the Mediterranean sun. The investigation into what happened on that 12th day of August is not simply a matter of tracing troop movements on a map. It is an attempt to isolate a signal from the noise of history, a signal that has been repeating for over a century, telling us that something about this event refuses to be buried. The narrative of the Vanishing Battalion is one of the most enduring mysteries of the First World War. It persists because it sits at the uncomfortable intersection of documented military failure and inexplicable phenomenon. The core of the anomaly lies in the discrepancy between the official reports of the time, the delayed discovery of remains, and the haunting testimony of 3 New Zealand soldiers who watched the advance from a vantage point above the battlefield. This testimony serves as the primary frequency of the lingering signal, the element that transforms a tragic tactical error into a ghost story. To understand the weight of this signal, we have to look at the witnesses. Reichardt, Podger, and Waldy were sappers with the New Zealand field engineers. They were not poets given to flighty metaphors, nor were they inexperienced recruits hallucinating from dehydration. They were hardened men observing the battlefield. Decades after the event, their sworn statements described a scene that defies conventional ballistics. They reported seeing a series of strange, loaf-shaped clouds floating over the battlefield. These clouds were described as distinct, identical in shape, and oddly stationary despite a blowing breeze. According to their account, one of these clouds settled directly over the dry creek bed known as Hill 60. This was the objective toward which the Norfolk Regiment was marching. The sappers watched as the British soldiers, some 250 strong, marched up the sunken road and straight into the density of the mist. The critical, chilling detail in their testimony is the finality of it. They claimed that the regiment marched in, but no one marched out. Shortly after the last man disappeared into the gray mass, the cloud lifted and drifted away against the wind, joining the other stationary clouds in the sky. The ground beneath it was empty. For an investigative journalist, this is where the signal distorts. We are forced to choose between the supernatural implication of physical dematerialization and the grim reality of accepted warfare. If we strip away the sensation of the cloud, we are left with a tactical disaster. The attack on August 12th was ordered late in the afternoon. The maps possessed by the British commanders were woefully inaccurate. The terrain was a nightmare of prickly oak, dried gullies, and hidden sniper nests. The Norfolks, led by Colonel Sir Horace Beauchamp, were pushing into a gap in the Ottoman lines, extending far beyond the support of their flanks. From a strategic perspective, they walked into a trap. They were cut off. The silence that followed was the silence of isolation. But the lingering signal of the mystery comes from the total absence of immediate evidence. Usually, in the days following a skirmish, bodies are visible. Wounded men crawl back. Equipment is scattered. In the case of the Sandringham Company, the silence was absolute. Sir Ian Hamilton, the commander of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, wrote in his dispatch that the battalion plunged into the smoke and mist and was never seen again. That specific phrasing, smoke and mist, provided the fertile soil in which the legend of the cloud would eventually take root. The signal grew stronger in the void of information. Back in England, specifically on the royal estate at Sandringham, the disappearance was personal. These were the king's men, grooms, gardeners, and farm laborers who had enlisted together. Queen Alexandra made repeated inquiries. The total lack of information regarding their fate created a vacuum that required an explanation. When human logic fails to provide a body or a prisoner of war notification, the human mind reaches for the extraordinary. It was not until the war ended in 1919 that the signal changed its tone. The outcome of the conflict allowed the British to return to Gallipoli, not as invaders, as excavators of their own tragedy. The Graves Registration Unit, tasked with the grim duty of identifying the fallen, began to comb the area around Suvla Bay. It was here that the Reverend Charles Pierrepont Edwards found something that should have silenced the mystery, yet somehow only complicated it. Edwards and his team discovered a mass of bodies well beyond the established front lines, deep within what had been Turkish territory. There were 122 corpses found in a ravine. The identification was difficult after 4 years of exposure to the elements and scavenging animals, but the badges were unmistakable. They were the Norfolks. The discovery of the bodies confirmed that the men had not been abducted by aliens or ascended into a metaphysical realm. They had died on the ground, likely on the day of the attack or shortly thereafter. However, the discovery introduced a new, darker anomaly. The report from the Graves Unit noted that many of the bodies were found in an area of roughly 1 square mile, implying a cohesive group. But there were rumors, never fully substantiated, but persistently whispered, that the men had been found with bullet wounds to the head, suggesting execution rather than death in combat. This theory posits that the Norfolks, exhausted and surrounded, had surrendered, only to be massacred by their captors. If this were true, the vanishing was a convenient cover for a war crime, and the mist, reported by Hamilton, was the fog of war used to obscure a grim reality. Yet, even with the bodies found, the signal of the supernatural persisted. Why? Because the location of the bodies did not entirely align with the testimony of the New Zealand sappers. The ravine where the bodies were found was significantly further inland than where the sappers claimed to see the cloud descend. This geographical discrepancy keeps the investigation alive. Did the sappers see a different unit? Was the cloud a separate event? A meteorological oddity common in the Dardanelles, known as a thermal inversion, which can create stationary, lens-shaped clouds. We must also consider the psychological component of the lingering signal. The story of the cloud appeared in print decades after the war, during a reunion of veterans. Memory is a malleable thing, subject to the pressures of trauma and the collective need for meaning. For the survivors of Gallipoli, the campaign was a senseless grinder of human life. The story of the cloud, a clean, bloodless disappearance, might have been a subconscious attempt to sanitize the horror of what happened to the Sandringham Company. It is far easier to believe your comrades were spirited away by a mysterious force than to accept they were cut down in a dusty ravine and left to rot for 4 years. The investigation leads us to a farmhouse in Norfolk. Decades later, families held onto the idea of the mystery long after the telegrams stopped coming. The concept of the lingering signal is best exemplified by a gold watch found on one of the bodies in 1919. It was returned to the family of Captain Beck, the King's Land agent who had led the company. The watch had stopped. It was a physical artifact of the tragedy, grounded in reality. And yet, the legend supersedes the artifact. When we talk about the Vanishing Battalion today, we rarely talk about the watch. We talk about the cloud. This suggests that the anomaly is not just in the event, but in the transmission of the history. The signal has been distorted by our desire for the uncanny. We look at the map of Suvla Bay, and we want there to be magic, even dark magic, because the alternative is merely sad. The topographical reality of the battlefield, the gullies that hide movement, the heat haze that mimics water and solidifies air, provides a rational framework for how a battalion could step out of sight and be slaughtered without a sound, traveling back to the main lines. The acoustic shadows of rugged terrain can swallow the noise of a massacre just as easily as a cloud can swallow a platoon. Ultimately, the lingering signal of the Norfolk Regiment is a frequency of doubt. It vibrates between the solid proof of the 122 bodies found by Reverend Edwards and the unshakable visual testimony of the 3 New Zealanders. Both things exist in the historical record. The bodies are in the ground, marked by headstones. The affidavit regarding the cloud is in the archives. They contradict each other, yet they describe the same moment in time. As we sift through the dust of the dossier, we are left with a composite image. We see men marching into a haze. We see the glint of bayonets disappearing into the white glare of the afternoon. We feel the heat. We hear the silence that follows. Whether that silence was caused by a shifting meteorological phenomenon or the sudden, brutal efficiency of machine gun fire, the result is the same. They vanished from the sight of their comrades, and they vanished from the lives of their families. The signal continues to transmit because we cannot fully reconcile the 2 versions of the truth. We are programmed to trust eyewitnesses, and we are programmed to trust forensic evidence. When they diverge so sharply, it creates a friction that generates heat, keeping the mystery alive. The Vanishing Battalion did not just disappear into the landscape of Turkey. They disappeared into the landscape of our imagination. The cloud, whether water vapor or myth, remains the defining image, hovering over the dry earth, refusing to dissipate, a permanent marker of the unknown in a war that was otherwise brutally, mechanically predictable. The signal lingers, faint but audible, asking us to look again at the heat haze and wonder what really lies behind it.